Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Alana James. I'm the founder and CEO of DoctoralNet. Most of the people watching this will be lucky enough to be at a university where your university has bought you this additional professional development as part of your work there. Today's conversation is about puzzling it out. Uh, when we look at literature, then we try to find gaps or we're moving towards significance. It's the way we look at literature at different parts of our career and as we are looking at it as a way forward to our own research. So I've chosen 3 different stories today at 3 different parts of both professional and student careers. And I think you'll have fun puzzling out what the literature meant to these people and how it ended up being part of their final significance of their work. At least that's what I hope so. The handouts today are available on this link, resources.doctoralnet.com, and then /out-lit-gaps-significance. And there are 5 there. The slides that you're looking at now, a spreadsheet that has 3 examples, and those will be what we'll discuss during this presentation, and then 1 each, the final docs from which those spreadsheets were developed. So we're going to start with some reflection. And I should have actually put these 1, 2, and 3 so the people in the room could vote on which best describes you. So consider number 1, are you a seasoned practitioner in your field, wanting to add to the literature in your field through your research? Or perhaps you're more like 2, a new student in your field, using your research to explore and define your work. Or 3, somewhere in between, a mature student who's using literature to refine what you know and use your research as a stepping stone for the rest of your career. Adrian's asking what PQ is. It stands for ProQuest. The spreadsheets that have PQ on them, those were studies I found in ProQuest Open. Anybody else want to vote on what you are, 1, 2, or 3? A seasoned practitioner. Mostly it's how you're going to use the lit, looking the lit in your field, looking to explore and define your work, or looking at it as a stepping stone. Okay, so we have a variety of reasons that we come to the literature. Very excellent to know where you are. And then how much do you already know about your topic? 1 would be a lot, 2 would be a good bit, 3 would be a little, and 4 would be a mixture. So you might know it a lot. You're looking for refinements. You might know a little, but you still could be looking for refinements to other things. So there could be a mixture there. Between 1 and 2, depends on the subtopic. Yes. Good. Very good. All right. So you're seeing now from the people in the room that as a group of students, you go into literature from a different position. Your position in your field, as how much you know, how much experience you have, definitely colors how you read literature. Because if you know a lot, then you're reading lit and kind of going yes, no, based on your own experience. If you don't know a lot, you don't have that filter. It's a matter of filters, isn't it? But you may be looking at it as how can this piece advance my career or advance my research? And then again, that filter of yes, no, yes, no. Okay, let's look at, so our goal is to use these 3 examples to discuss the pivot points. And that's how I see using literature. We go into it for one of our reasons. We have our filters on. We're reading, and then something happens. And that something is a defining moment that guides our next bit of research. And it could be a cluster of moments, but we're looking at this today as though what were those moments? What caused the pivot points? And then our agenda is the seasoned practitioner, newly back at school, someone who was looking for significance in their own setting, and someone who was building significance by merging fields in a creative way. So these are three different kinds of pivot points. So now you're going to have the spreadsheet open, and just in case any of you came later, I'll put it in again. Always useful to have the link right there if you haven't gotten it out yet. You want to have the spreadsheet open. And the first story is actually a story I can tell because I was part of the story. I was helping the student. And so this is a seasoned practitioner, but newly come back to school. So someone who's been a psychologist out in the field working for 30 years, had a particular niche of helping foster care families, and went back to school to get his doctorate. Raise your hand if that is a story similar to anybody here in the room. Yes. Okay. So you have a lot of experience. Good. All right. So, you know, I think that the non-traditional student, the one who comes back to school with a lot of experience, has so much to offer, both to your classes and also to the field of literature. This was certainly one of those cases. Refer now to the spreadsheet. This is the slide. First thing is we want to talk about is the way he thought about the lit. And so if you go to that spreadsheet and you just read down, these are more or less the way these clusters of people ended up in his document. And if I'm hoping everybody here attended the previous webinar on how to use a spreadsheet to define your ideas. If he had been building a spreadsheet, each one of these references would have been their own box, and he would have been working out the main points, what they said about neglect or foster care, or how he was building the significance. And then when he was writing, he would have been able to click on that column, put them all in order, and organize his thoughts. But I did it slightly differently by looking at the final document and then putting them together this way. So we see at the beginning a conversation about early neglect, and he's dealing with the most troubled children in foster care, the ones that have 10 placements. And why are they so difficult? Often because they had neglect in their early childhood. Their brains didn't develop properly. As a result, they have a cognitive, emotional disruption as a result of that neglect, and that is called complex attachment disorder. Literally, they don't know about or how to trust any human attachment. So it makes them very, very difficult to be in foster care, and as a result, things happen and they go from one foster care to another. And that was the milieu of work that this man was an expert in. So when he first comes to the literature, he looks up people that he knows, people that he studied, and he develops, and also the history of how these thoughts about complex attachment disorder developed. There's just a lot of literature. And when I first met him, he had a lot of literature on these issues, but was having a struggle getting it into a place where it became researchable. Because when we first look at the lit, we find what is known, But then we need to make that pivot jump. So let's track his. So first we see conversations about what is neglect and what is complex attachment disorder, the difficulty of it, the consequences of it, which are biological as well as cognitive and emotional. Because the brain doesn't develop, there's a little bit there, I've colored it yellow, where it's going, the basic conversation is beginning to get to foster care, which is where he knows he wants to take it, because foster care is what he can research. And the question then is, what all of these things are what make these children difficult. All right, so then he has a lot of history. And I think this is a typical issue for people who are sorting out things, is there's a tendency to look into the history of how something developed. Unfortunately, history doesn't often take us to a researchable pivot point. So it can be difficult. In this case, he had a lot of history. And we had to cut it down to get it to the pivot point. Finally, we're getting into this issue of foster agencies. Now we're into the practical aspect of fostering. So the second subject, 52,000 children in foster care in the United Kingdom. That's a lot of children. The most complex cases have the most foster care. They cost the state the most. So therein lies the problem. But then again, he's still struggling to get to the researchable question. And then there's the beginning of, now it's a psychological degree. So he's getting into the ways new treatments have developed, and you see the yellow. And that's where the pivot point happens. So when you're discussing treatment and psychological work, you have a situation where a child in foster care comes in for an appointment every so often and gets this particular kind of treatment. But the fact is, these children live every day with the foster carer. And then the question becomes, what can foster carers do that can augment treatment, that can actually build the same kind of self-efficacy in the child that treatment builds? That's the pivot point. Then you'll see I quoted at the bottom directly from his document, and you have the document there. The significance of this piece is that it fills previous gaps in literature, which was, how does foster care, what can foster care do? That's the gap. It identifies foster carers as part of a therapeutic package, and his was a practitioner research package, so he had to go on and actually develop a program that put this in place and tested it. And then it supports and makes use of new neurobiological findings in a new setting, which was foster care. Adrian asks, was he formulating his research question at this point? He had, okay, so I have to say a little bit there about the differences between being in the United States and doing doctoral research and being in Europe and doing doctoral research. In Europe, it's more typical that you turn in a lit review and some kind of general direction, and then you get your ethical review based upon who you're asking, but without the same absolute knock it down clarity that you have if you are defending a proposal as you are in the United States. Lots of reasons for that, but the differences between them, it ends up that at the end of the day, you as a student will struggle either direction. You'll just struggle for different reasons. So when he came to me, he had research questions, and the research questions amounted to the foster carers who do a good job with these very difficult children. What is it that they are doing? And he was looking for whether what they were doing, in fact, correlated to best known treatment, neurological understanding, etc. And he used appreciative inquiry. He was looking for what works. And he did, I think, 15 sets of foster carers, appreciative inquiry, listened to what they did. And then he built out the multi-level therapeutic package, of which they had done parts of it, and then put it more in place and tested it out. So that's how his work developed over time. Any other questions? Any other comments? So it's very difficult when you know where you want to go. You have to find, like, he knew foster carers weren't taken seriously. He knew from all of his reading that he wasn't finding anything about therapeutic foster care. In fact, it was almost, would not have been an acceptable phrase in his field that there could be such a thing as therapeutic foster care. He felt very strongly that there could be, and as a practitioner, he went about figuring out how he could massage this doctoral work that we do to get to that point. I see some people coming and going. I hope we're not having challenges with the website. If you do ever drop out of a big marker meeting, we are recording, so you can see it. So reflective questions for those in the room. Is there anything about this example that is similar either in the way you thought about literature at one time, or your situation, or perhaps the outcome that you'd like to achieve, which in this case would be filling a gap, using your practitioner knowledge to fill a gap you know is going on in the field. Does that ring a bell with anybody here? And if so, which one? The literature is the story. Crystal, tell me what you mean by that, please. As she's typing, anybody else feel like or know of perhaps practitioners trying to use their PhD experience to advance something they know is going on in their field? It's a little difficult place because you don't have kind of the student mind of being wide open. And it's a place where you really have to pin yourself down on not creating bias in your research because you do know so much. Those are the challenges. Using the literature to weave the tale that backs the argument I'm trying to make. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Let's go on to the next story. This is a student. This is PQ understanding. As I told Adrian earlier, PQ stands for ProQuest. I use ProQuest Open. You can type in ProQuest Open, and you'll find a very rich database of finished dissertations and theses, primarily from the United States, but not exclusively, and of all different types. And I use them as exemplars as we pull apart and discuss how these documents work. So these next two are not students I know personally, and I don't know the actual step-by-step of how this developed, but you still can tell very much from reading one of these documents what the pivot points were. Where they came in their own personal journey, we don't know, but we do know from the way a document goes is step by step what the significant points are that we need to look at as a reader. So if you'll go now to the PQ understanding page. All right, so this student is making the case that it's like a three-part case. She or he, I've forgotten, is at a online university and is making the case that online universities or online degrees can fill a gap between universities and the workplace by doing a good job of sorting out how students progress with critical thinking. So it requires a couple of steps. It requires that we understand the importance of critical thinking and what is known about it. It requires that we know about the essence of critical thinking is that it is a skill. We can learn it, and it helps not only with our way we think about the world, but also our self-perception. And that her research hinges on the idea that we can measure critical thinking, we can measure self-perception of ourselves, and that when there's a good match, the student will do better. So that's where she finally gets to. Let's go through the lit and see how she gets there. So critical thinking in an educational setting is circular. I thought that was interesting. The critical thinking formulates the curriculum, which then informs the adult students on how to behave. So that's an interesting idea, that how we behave is informed by what goes on around us. And we see other people in class and they're thinking very critically, and that enhances our criticality ability. It also informs educators then on how to cultivate that learning, because we are hopefully facilitating that learning in a situation. And then as those develop and become stronger, models are constructed and new things happen, which segued with some literature on universities setting up situational learning patterns that help students with their beliefs about their perception. So those two pieces together were juxtaposed in her problem statement. Feedback, constructive, evaluative, with the aim to affect competencies is a way to develop skills. Both critical thinking and perception had that thread through it. So she's beginning to kind of weave the patterns together. Requires teachers and universities have a trajectory in mind. Now she's getting into where she wants to take us. That's the university's responsibility for trajectory. And in fairness, I think she did a really good job of the first two. I felt like her university trajectory part was a little weaker. And I chose this story because I see students fumbling around in their field, not sure what they want to study. Maybe it's been difficult finding a topic. And they fall back, it feels like falling back often, on their particular educational context. So you might be in a lab setting, and a particular way of doing business in that lab is your environment. And so when you're not sure exactly where you want to push forward, you fall back to what is around you. And I think that can be true in any field on any university campus. And it might even be stronger if your particular field has some people in it, some academic scholars who are excellent, because they can often color the way a field is studied in a particular environment. And that's what happened here. This was an online environment, and she's studying how the universities can help manage perception. And I'm not sure she does a great job of that. Anyway, so students' willingness to infer learning, the definition of critical thinking, it includes the need for self-perception within a social environment. And now she's getting into what would be the predictors. As the lit goes on, you can almost see where the different columns are beginning to get filled in, where she's trying to lead the reader to think that there's some predictors about the university's ability to guide critical thinking in students, with the fact that it's well known that the more students engage in academic activities, the more successful they are in academic activities. There isn't, by the way, in case you're a student who doesn't engage much, there is no correlation between whether you engage in activities on campus and later do well. Well, there's far less correlation. Confidence. So now there's some personal things, whether the person has confidence, and what she ends up with is, oh, I apologize. At the beginning, there's a lot above the gray line. There's a lot of background information. So older people talking about education, talking about how people learn, and introducing the Watson-Glasser instrument, which is a well-known, it's published by Pearson, and it's a well-known instrument. If you're interested in studying your own ability to think critically, I recommend you go. There are several free trials on the web that you can test out. And so what the ended up research was, she gave the Watson-Glasser instrument to a group of people, and she studied them personally to see whether or not they had a perception of themselves as a critical thinker. And naturally, she found that the more you do to help a student have a perception of themselves as a critical thinker, the better they do on the test, or the better they do on the test, the more they have a perception. It goes back and forth. And those students who had a close, where the two agreed with each other closely, were the ones who did best in the course. Her outcome, therefore, is obvious that the university would do well to notice how students are doing with critical thinking, to help students do better with critical thinking, and to encourage students to think of themselves critically, to reflect critically, etc. So background, top half, gray line, that's the pivot point. And I have to make a particular comment about this pivot point. She found a study that recommended this study she did. And I had when I was working for universities, I had a student call this doc in a box. For a student who is really struggling, trying to find a topic area, trying to find something they want to study, it's getting late, they're being pushed. One thing that can be quite successful is either doing what she did and finding a study within the general topic areas that she's interested in that clearly said, as a recommended next step, somebody should do X, Y, and Z. And then you do X, Y, and Z, and you're fulfilling a gap in the literature that was recommended by somebody else. Your significance to your study is predetermined. You can also do essentially an identical study to what somebody else did and change out the environment it's in. So you can take a study from sometime a wildly divergent field that actually has quite a bit of bearing on what you're doing and replicate it. And we'll see an example of that kind of creativity in a moment. So let me see what you've said. as I've talked through this. Does the research gap does it have to be built upon previous research? Well, it will. I think, does it have to be, implies that, and there is certainly one way of finding your gap is to go through research and figure out where the gaps are. If you're a practitioner in the field, you may intuitively know that what you want to study isn't being covered in the literature, and therefore you have a gap. The word gap implies that there's something about the literature that is not yet filled out, and that builds the significance of your work. It's a different story, maybe. I'm thinking out loud now, so I may contradict myself in a minute, but is it the same as building significance? Can you have a significant study without having a gap? I'm thinking you could do a study that was a lot bigger than anybody else had done it. You could do a study that was of a population no one else had done, but people could still make a case that those were gaps in the literature as well. Am I answering your question, Di? If not, keep asking and I'll come back to it. What is the relation between the lit gaps we find and our own research objectives and questions? You're asking such good questions. Your question, first off, I have to say about questions that they will evolve over time. You want to get them as close as you can, but even very close to the end, you might be slightly massaging what those questions ask, because you're trying to drill the questions into a cogent story with what went on in the research and the outcome, so that when it publishes, all of it becomes one complete story. So that's the first question about the relationship. The relationship is that there's we call it a golden thread between your literature, what's gone on in the past, the gaps or the holes that you see in that literature, the questions you ask, and most importantly, the research that you do and the results and findings that you have. That's one big story. My hunch is that given the literature has identified the different aspects of the development, the early neglect. Okay, so this is the first one. Appears that one researchable arena is to the extent foster care may serve to match the facilitative conditions for growth in those aspects. Yes, Adrian, put another way, that's what he was after. Could you use the gaps you find in literature to further expand your thoughts in your own thesis? Yes, and your thoughts and your research have a very close connection to each other at the end. Could you address the fact that you notice these gaps, and even if you do not solve all of the problems, would your identification of them add to the scope of your work? Might not add to the scope of your work, but it would add to your field in your recommendations. In your conclusion and discussion section at the end, you almost always have recommendations, and you can make a recommendation, Allison, that these other gaps were uncovered during the literature review or during the process of this research, and unfortunately this research, the scope of this research did not allow us to fill those gaps, but I would recommend that other researchers look for them. Then what you've done is set up a very nice place for the next person to step off of. And they probably will cite you, which is good for you as well. So as long as finding the gap, the significance will come out. Di, yes, and when you find a gap between things, Then, and you may have multiple gaps. For instance, it might be that you're looking at a situation. This is why I like working in spreadsheets, because you have all these different things that are coming out from all these authors, and then you sort your columns and you see that some columns aren't very long. So clearly those things aren't well covered. Is that a big enough gap for you to be interested in? What you have to get, I think you have to be very practical. You want to have a study big enough to be interesting, big enough to have significance, small enough you can get it done and get on with your life. So those things come together as you're massaging these. As I said, for this student, well on her way to look at the skills gap in the United States and how critical thinking is the most important skill. And if you read everything above that gray line, it's pretty commonly known ideas about the change in the workforce, the change required, certainly hand in glove with what we did this summer with transferable skills. And then all of a sudden there's this, oh, how could it get measured? It could get measured in the distance between your perception of yourself and your critical thinking as it is, as it can be defined by a test. And then by being defined by a test, you learn what you're not doing as well as you think you can do, and you get better. At some point, you stop massaging and you vigorously shake it. Annalene, good to see you again. That's it. It's a process. What we're talking about right now is looking at people's work that got it done. They did a beautiful job of it. All of these are very nice studies. They're all very interesting studies. And you know that at some point they were a person just like you, into your literature, trying to figure out exactly where they wanted to point their work. So let's go on to the next. Let's asking questions here, the reflection. Raise your hand, please, if anything in this one is similar to the way you thought about it. Maybe you had a pretty, here you were studying something that was very well known, and then you're looking for that stepping off point. And maybe you're looking for an outcome that leads you to a study that can kind of add to these kind of big ideas you're studying. Isn't that fit anybody here in the room? Well, no hands going up. Okay. Let's see if the next one does better. This one was very interesting study. Interesting because this is a person being guided by a first-class scholar. And the way I know that, thank you, Crystal, for raising your hand. The way I know that is because on his cover sheet, when you sign, and this is so-and-so in your thesis, that this is George Washington University, and the mentor or committee chair was this professor, and the professor was what award he had won for being an outstanding scholar was under his name on this front cover. So he's being mentored by somebody who really knows their field. It was a beautiful study. And when you're mentored by somebody who has a really deep understanding of the field, you sometimes are lucky enough to get a glimpse that can help your pivot points. I don't know for a fact that that's what happened here, but it was worthy of consideration. So if you go to your spreadsheet for PQ understanding, it's understanding the gender disparity in the STEM fields by looking at the star performers. Okay, That's the title, so we know that's where we're going. The first section of it, really, much like the last one we looked at, starts off with a lot of literature about stuff that's fairly well known. We know there's a gender disparity in the STEM fields, and we know there's a number of people who write about it from different aspects. One aspect is that it's a biological difference between the sexes. Men are genetically primed to do better. It may be testosterone related. And the way that they acknowledge that what the output that they talk about that from is that men consistently outperform in testing situations. And those data come from meta-analysis. And the nature of meta-analysis is that it's built upon data that's delivered over a long period of time. So it could be considered dated. Another series of lit is that men points out the other side of that similar story. Men have more variability in their quantitative abilities as they test, and therefore the bell curve that we're looking at there is big on both ends. Then there's a whole body of research that says women aren't in the STEM fields because they're pushed out. They're pushed out because of discrimination, and the sociologically prone to have sexism as an issue, and it all the way down to what job you get and what are your advantages at performing at that job. And that takes us just a tiny bit into this idea of what's the star performance level. The next body, and there were 4 major stories here. Women are perceived as less competent. Perceived as less competent. Not that they are less competent, but Pigmarker disconnected me for a minute. Am I back on? Reconnecting. Okay. Oh, several people. Good. All right, we're back. Crystal lost it as well. Somehow, I guess there was a glitch in the internet system. So we're talking then about women may have advantage in being hired, but less advantage in going further. And there was even something called the queen bee effect, where a woman at the top is less likely to have a high regard for other women coming up. So the sociological studies on this situation. And then finally, that women just make different career choices. So they may not be interested in doing the kinds of things that put them into the dog-eat-dog way of trying to get to be a star performer. That's the background. If you go below the gray line, though, you see the pivot point is this concept, and the first reference there is the literature about star performers. And what's interesting here is that this literature is not based on STEM. Or if it is, it's based on certain parts of STEM. The idea being that within every field, there are some people who produce more quality work that gets picked up and carried on, usually because they're writing for and published in peer-reviewed journals of a very high caliber. So those are star performers, and you can judge a star performer by looking at where they have been published and how many citations they have after them. And those things are pretty easy to find out today. And that was the pivot. You had this pretty normal literature about women in STEM. How are you going to make it a study? What are you going to do with it? Well, then this idea comes in that, oh, study it differently. Don't study the curve. Study the top right-hand end of the curve. And then, and this is the last number 9 list, I think it's he found a methodology that investigates the shape distributions of different distribution systems. And those that had been done in other fields, not in this field, not in this way, but basically by plotting the shape, you can investigate whether it's a normal curve, an exponential curve, logarithmic, whether power is involved, what kind of power, etc. And it ended up being quite clearly that women had, and I didn't actually go deeply into the outcomes, but basically, if we want women to have a longer range ability in the STEM, these things have to be overcome because the distribution is such that they just don't have the advantages that would carry them forward. What was interesting was studying something that was well known from a completely different viewpoint. So what are your questions, and how many of you might have something similar to this going on in your research? Where you've got, you're really interested in something, but it's hard to find that new edge that is going to make your work different enough to carry it forward. Okay. So then, have you considered, Hassan, looking outside your field, or looking in other? If you're in the STEMs, all what the STEMs have in common is that they use mathematics, they use testing orientation, they use ability to study small quantities and in large, capacities, and recently had to look outside towards blockchain application in your industry. That's it. So when stuck, when involved in taking your literature through, looking for gaps, trying to find the pivot points, what we've seen then is 3 different options. Finding a pivot point based upon your own background, and then drilling into what you know it should be there, what you know, looking, and when it's not there, figuring out how to study it so that others find it interesting, or looking at your own personal situation, where you are in your learning, or where you are in your field and the environment of your field, and coming up with some places that can be studied from a slightly different angle, and or looking completely into a new place and transposing what's been done somewhere else into what you want to do. Still carrying out more literature review over the next 2 weeks. Lit goes on and on and on too. Another reason that I always recommend people put it in a spreadsheet, because you'll have your lit now and you'll base your study, you'll build it on the study, but then at the end you have to go back and catch up on the lit that's happened since you started your study, to see what other things get filled in. Good. So let's have discussion. Anybody have anything in this that you want to talk about from your point of view? I bet other people in the room would have suggestions as well. I'm just going back up. And Adrian had mentioned that gaps in theory can be theoretical between theory and practice, whereas significance can be conceptual, theoretical, methodological, empirical, and or practical implications. Well done. You thought that through in an excellent way. Those are all true. Methodological significance is also a gap, though, because it's significant because nobody else has studied it that way. I think each one of those, it's almost a matter of how we filter, whether we write about it like it's a big conceptual theoretical breakthrough or it's a gap in the literature. And I think that might too have to do with your particular committee and how they help you see your work. Strategy has been to leverage each course for a subtopic for the lit review. Yeah, I would say that's why the courses are set up to be the way they are in most cases. Every time you have to write a paper for a course, it throws you into literature. And every time you get thrown into literature, you're looking for things that are interesting. The more you have, or the quicker you have an idea of what's the interest for you personally, then the faster you can be questioning your profs during a course on what they know about that, or, just kind of bringing up interesting topics of conversation. We can imagine, or I can imagine, these people who ended up doing excellent work, what their real paths might have been like, who was interesting to them, who turned them on to some of these people that they later quote in their work, how they saw their work develop, and now at the end, how they talk about it. Any other raise your hand if you have other things to discuss. Okay. Heavy lit to do, even interdisciplinaries, then to find legitimate gaps. Yeah, good conversation. Especially when we're talking about any of the things like blockchain that are developing now, because they're developing across so many fields. And nobody's pinned to the lit. None of it's going to be, oh yeah, that old stuff. We know all that. So question for you all, do you think it's harder or easier to study something that's on the innovative side? I seem to be combining e-commerce, architecture, construction, yes, interdisciplinary. And is all innovation right now, to some extent, interdisciplinary? Oh, good. Yeah. That way the handouts can be available for everybody, whether or however this gets transposed. Well, this is my last webinar of this year. I'm off for the United States and discussing professional development online at the Council of Graduate Schools meeting in Washington. And then it's the end of the year and we're getting ready to start next year. And it occurs to me that this is a time of year where, as a student, you may have a lot of things going on, that will take you away from your student experience, or your student experience may be ending for a few weeks or even a month or more as the year changes. And it can be difficult to keep your student life and your moving forward on your dissertation life moving ahead at the same time there's all these other distractions. So it might be a good time of year, if you're interested, to check out the opt-ins, the 30-day writing challenge. These things come to you in emails. They are experiential, so they come over a series of time. And we find that people use them to, we all look at our emails, and it keeps our mind kind of going into one place. So there's 10 days in a row of an academic writing boost. There's the 30-day writing challenge, if you want to keep a little bit of writing going. If you're just shy on motivation at the moment, the motivational emails are outstanding. They're not just you can do it, but also here's examples and interesting talks and good links. And you might not need them every day, but they can keep your life going. So other things you might be interested in. And that's it for me for this year. Yes. Annalene, are you going to finish? You're welcome, Allison. I appreciate all of you coming, and I hope it's been useful. On a scale of 1 to 5, how good was today? Did it help your work? 5 would be a lot. 4 would be somewhat, made you think in new ways. 3, maybe it'll pan out over time. 2, less likely. What counts is not so much what we say, but that it's useful to you. You're welcome, all of you. Any other votes coming in? Come back at the Dr. Maria is talking about theory on Thursday, and several other excellent conversations throughout the month of December. And then we come back in January and kick off getting the year started in an excellent way. Oh, good. Good. Newton, I'm glad to hear that. Oh, Adrian, that's excellent. The depth of the gap can grow. Your understanding of what it is as a gap. Yeah, I think that was true of the first man that I worked with. His understanding of how little was really known about foster care really grew. If I don't see any of you again, if you're not in the lingerers group, which will be the only thing I touch in on, I hope you all have an excellent end of your year. And look for our end of year card. We have a little bit of fireworks coming for you at the last. Finishing as you speak. Excellent. Well done, Annalene. Happy holidays, everyone. However you celebrate the end of the year. Hopefully with family and friends. Hopefully making some happy memories.